The cold ceramic of the espresso cup shattered against the floor, but the sound was drowned out by the metallic click of a dozen safety catches being disengaged. I stood behind the mahogany bar of the velvet drip, my hands buried in dishwater that had turned ice cold. 3 inches from my nose, the barrel of a gold-plated Desert Eagle gleamed under the dim amber pendants. The man holding it didn't blink. His tailored suit cost more than the building, and his eyes held the flat, dead stillness of a deep-sea predator. "I asked for 3 sugars, Lena," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that rattled the teaspoons in their jars. "And I don't like being told no by someone who smells like cheap beans and desperation." Around him, men in shadows stepped forward, their silhouettes cutting off every exit, their hands disappearing into the linings of silk jackets. 6 hours ago, I was just a woman trying to make rent, venting my frustration on a customer who sat in my corner booth for 4 hours without ordering more than a black coffee. I thought he was just another arrogant suit with a god complex. I didn't know that by snapping back, I had just signed a death warrant for everyone I had ever loved. This is the moment the world stopped being about tips and latte art and became a game of blood and leverage. If you want to understand how a spilled drink turned into a citywide manhunt, you have to see the moment the mask came off. I grabbed the damp rag from my shoulder and wiped the counter with short, jerky motions. The man in the corner booth tapped a heavy signet ring against the marble. Clack, clack, clack. It was 4:55 a.m., and my shift was a blur of steam and aching arches. He hadn't touched his cup in 30 minutes. "Sir, the sign says 30 minutes for non-customers," I said, not looking up. My voice was dry, sandpaper on silk. "Either buy another drink or clear the booth. I have a line forming." The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. He leaned forward, his face emerging from the shadow of his brimmed hat. He wasn't old, but his skin had the weathered tightness of someone who had seen too much sun and too much blood. "You have a lot of teeth for a girl in a paper hat," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "And you have a lot of nerve taking up space while people are standing in the rain," I retorted, finally meeting his gaze. I slammed a fresh menu onto his table. "Order or go." He stood up slowly. He was taller than he looked sitting down, a pillar of dark fabric that seemed to swallow the light. He reached into his pocket. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't back down. I held the plastic tray like a shield. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill, crumpled it into a ball, and dropped it into the cold remains of his coffee. "Keep the change," he said, walking toward the door. "You're going to need it for the flowers." The bell chimed as he exited, the cold morning air rushing in to replace the scent of his expensive cologne. I stood there, my knuckles white on the tray, watching his black sedan melt into the gray fog of the city. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had won a petty victory over a rude stranger. 10 minutes later, the back door of the cafe kicked open. My manager, Marcus, didn't scream. He didn't have time. A man in a gray tracksuit dragged him across the floor by his hair, throwing him into the industrial fridge. The metal groaned. Marcus's glasses skittered across the tiles, stopping at my feet. "Where is she?" a new voice demanded. I stepped out from behind the espresso machine, my breath hitching. The man from the booth wasn't there, but his signet ring was etched into the lapel pins of the 4 men now vaulting over my counter. I reached for the heavy iron tamper, my fingers closing around the cold metal. I wasn't going to go quietly into the fridge. "I'm right here," I said, my voice steadying as the adrenaline surged. I swung the tamper, catching the first man across the bridge of his nose. The sound of breaking bone filled the small kitchen. But before I could swing again, a heavy hand clamped onto my throat, lifting me off my feet until my toes scraped the floorboards. "The Kingpin wants a word," the man hissed, his breath smelling of menthol and copper. He threw me toward the black sedan waiting in the alley, the door swinging open like the mouth of a shark. The leather interior of the car was suffocating. I sat between 2 men who smelled of gun oil and silence. We didn't move toward the police station. We moved toward the docks, where the city's lights died and the shadows took over. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of pain through my bruised neck. I watched the digital clock on the dashboard, 5:12 a.m. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice a jagged rasp. The man to my right didn't turn his head. He just checked the chamber of his pistol, the click echoing in the cramped space. "He's the man who owns the water you drink and the air you breathe. And you just told him to clear his booth." We pulled into a warehouse that smelled of salt and decaying wood. The sedan stopped in a circle of light created by the overhead rafters. They dragged me out, my heels dragging in the grit. In the center of the floor sat a single chair. And in front of it, a table with a porcelain tea set that looked wildly out of place in the grime. The man from the cafe, the Kingpin, was pouring tea. He didn't look at me as they shoved me into the chair. He blew on the steam, his movements graceful and terrifyingly calm. "Sit," he said. "We have a lot to discuss regarding your customer service skills." "I don't serve people who threaten my manager," I spat, though my stomach was doing somersaults. He looked up then, his eyes boring into mine. He picked up a small spoon and began to stir. Clink, clink, clink. "Marcus is alive. For now. Whether he stays that way depends on how well you can answer a single question." He leaned across the table, his face inches from mine. "Why weren't you afraid of me in the cafe, Lena?" "Everyone is afraid of me. Even the mayor trembles when I call." "But you looked at me like I was trash on your shoe." "Because you were," I said. The man to my left stepped forward to strike me, but the Kingpin raised a hand. The silence returned, thicker than before. He reached into a wooden box on the table and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the wetwood. It was a picture of me. Not from today. It was from 10 years ago, standing in front of a burning house in the North End. My face was covered in soot and I was holding a charred teddy bear. "I've been looking for you for a long time, little spark," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your father owed me a debt that even death couldn't erase. And it seems you've inherited his mouth, and his liabilities. If you believe Lena deserved a life away from her father's shadow, hit the like button so her story reaches someone who knows what it's like to be hunted by the past." The warehouse doors groaned as a second fleet of cars arrived. The headlights flickered against the corrugated metal walls. The Kingpin didn't flinch. He just sipped his tea as the warehouse erupted in motion. Men in tactical gear, far more professional than the thugs who snatched me, spilled out of the new vehicles. These weren't Mafia. The DA lettering on their vests caught the swinging light. "Drop the weapon, Moretti," a voice boomed through a megaphone. Moretti, the Kingpin, didn't drop his gun. He didn't even stand up. He looked at me and smiled, a cold, thin line. "It seems your little tantrum attracted the wrong kind of attention, Lena. Or perhaps the right kind." He grabbed my arm, his grip of ice, and pulled me toward a hidden door behind a stack of crates. Gunfire shredded the air behind us, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of submachine guns turning the warehouse into a slaughterhouse. We ran through a tunnel that smelled of damp earth and old rot. "Why are you taking me?" I yelled over the chaos. "If you want me dead, do it now." "Because you're the only one who knows the code to the North End vault," he hissed, shoving me into a small, motorized skiff tied to the dock at the end of the tunnel. "Your father didn't just leave you a burnt house. He left you the keys to my kingdom. And I'm not letting the feds get their hands on either." He jumped into the boat and ripped the starter cord. The engine roared to life, and we shot out into the harbor just as the warehouse behind us erupted in a fireball that turned the night into noon. The shockwave nearly capsized us. I gripped the sides of the boat, the cold spray hitting my face. "I don't know any code," I screamed. "You don't know you know it," he replied, his eyes fixed on the black horizon. "But you will. Or Marcus dies very slowly." We hit the open water, the city skyline receding into a blur of neon and smoke. I looked back at the burning dock, my life as a barista disappearing in the flames. I wasn't Lena the waitress anymore. I was a ghost from a burnt house, trapped on a boat with the Kingpin of the city, heading toward a vault that I didn't even believe existed. Every few minutes, Moretti checked a small GPS device. His hand was bleeding, a dark stain spreading across his silk cuff. He didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the dark silhouette of an island ahead, a jagged rock topped with a crumbling lighthouse. "That's where it is," he said. "The North End vault isn't in the city. It's under the sea." As we approached the rock, the water began to churn. A platform began to rise from the depths, a massive disk of rusted steel and barnacles. The skiff glided onto it, and with a mechanical groan, we began to descend. The sky vanished, replaced by the damp walls of an underwater shaft. If you believe Lena is stronger than the men trying to use her, drop a like so the algorithm knows this story matters. The elevator stopped with a bone-jarring thud. We were in a corridor of white tile and flickering fluorescent lights. It looked like a laboratory from a nightmare. Moretti shoved me forward, his gun pressed into the small of my back. We reached a massive steel door with no handle, only a keypad that required a 20-digit sequence. "Input it," he commanded. "I told you I don't know it," I cried, my voice echoing off the sterile walls. He grabbed my hand and forced it onto the keypad. "Think, Lena. The night of the fire. Your father whispered something to you before he pushed you out the window. Think of the numbers. Think of the rhythm." I closed my eyes. The smell of smoke filled my mind. The heat. The roar of the flames. My father's face covered in blood, his lips moving against my ear. 14-22-09. My fingers began to move. I didn't think. I just followed the ghost of a memory. 14-22-09-55-01. The keypad beeped with every entry. The air in the corridor felt thin, like all the oxygen was being sucked into the vault. November 4th, 32. I hit the final digit. The vault didn't open. A red light flashed and a siren began to wail, a high-pitched shriek that felt like a needle in my brain. Incorrect, a mechanical voice intoned. Self-destruct sequence initiated. T-5 minutes. Moretti roared, slamming his fist against the steel. You lied. You tried to kill us both. He turned the gun on me, his face contorted in rage. If I'm going down, you're going first. He pulled the trigger. The click of a dry fire was the loudest sound in the room. He stared at the weapon, then back at me. I didn't wait. I lunged, grabbing a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and swinging it with everything I had. It caught him in the temple and he crumpled to the floor, his gold gun skittering into the shadows. I ran back to the elevator, but the doors were locked. The shaft was filling with water. I looked at the keypad again. My father didn't give me numbers. He gave me a song. A nursery rhyme he used to sing when I was a kid. I looked at the keypad. The numbers corresponded to letters in the old phone style. I typed out the words of the song. Littlespark. The vault door hissed and swung open. But it didn't lead to gold or ledgers. It led to a small room with a single computer terminal and a glass case containing a small, charred teddy bear, exactly like the one I was holding in the photo. Final sequence accepted, the voice said. Destruct cancelled. Welcome home, Lena. I stepped inside, the door locking behind me. I was safe from the water and the feds, but I was trapped in a room built by a dead man's guilt. I sat at the terminal. The screen flickered to life, showing a video of my father. If you're seeing this, Lena, then Moretti is dead or close to it, the man on the screen said. And you have a choice to make. You can stay in the dark or you can become the kingpin the city actually needs. If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. I stared at my father's face on the flickering monitor. He looked younger, the lines of stress not yet etched into his forehead. Behind him I could see the layout of the city's power grid, glowing in neon greens and blues. The vault isn't filled with money, Lena, my father's voice continued, crackling through the speakers. It's filled with the truth. Every bribe, every murder, every secret that keeps the gears of this city turning is stored on these drives. Moretti thought he was protecting his empire, but he was just guarding his own gallows. I reached out and touched the glass case containing the charred teddy bear. It wasn't just a memento. It was a hard drive. I pulled it out, the weight of it surprising me. Suddenly, the monitor switched to a live feed of the corridor outside. Moretti was groggily pushing himself off the floor, blood matting his hair. He was fumbling for his gun, his eyes wild and unfocused. He saw the open vault door and began to crawl toward it. Lena, he screamed, his voice a pathetic shadow of the kingpin who had threatened me in the cafe. Give it to me. I can make you a queen. You don't have to be a waitress anymore. I walked to the threshold of the vault. I didn't have a gun. I didn't need one. I looked at the control panel next to the door. I was never just a waitress, Moretti, I said, my voice cold and clear. I was the one waiting for you to trip. I slammed the close button. The steel door hissed shut, catching Moretti's fingers. He shrieked, a sound that was cut short by the final thud of the locks engaging. I turned back to the terminal. There was a button marked Broadcast All. I looked at the teddy bear in my hand. If I pushed that button, the city would burn. Not with fire, but with justice. Every corrupt cop, every bought judge, every man who had ever looked at me like I was trash on a shoe, would be exposed. But it would also mean I could never go back to the velvet drip. I could never go back to a life where the only thing I had to worry about was 3 sugars in a black coffee. I thought of Marcus trapped in the fridge. I thought of my father dying in the flames to protect this room. I pushed the button. The screens in the vault went white as terabytes of data flooded the city's networks. Above me, I could hear the distant sound of sirens, not coming for me, but for the men whose names were now scrolling across every news ticker in the country. The elevator hummed. It was descending. This time, the doors opened to reveal a woman in a dark suit with a badge I didn't recognize. She wasn't Mafia. Lena Moretti? She asked. Just Lena, I said, clutching the teddy bear to my chest. The city is in chaos, the woman said looking at the screens. But the people are cheering. You did what we couldn't do in 30 years. Now come with us. There are people who want to meet the woman who broke the Kingpin. I walked out of the vault, stepping over the unconscious Moretti. I didn't look back at the rock or the lighthouse. I looked at the elevator ceiling as we rose toward the surface. The sun was finally coming up over the harbor, the gray fog burning away to reveal a city that looked brand new. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth, and the moments that turn ordinary people into legends. I stood on the deck of the government cutter, the salt spray cooling my face. In the distance, the skyline of the city glittered, but the neon signs of the major corporations were dark. The blackout I had triggered was temporary, but the shift in power was permanent. I reached into my pocket and found the $100 bill Moretti had crumpled into his coffee cup. I looked at it for a long time, then let it fly from my fingers. The wind caught it, spinning it away into the wake of the boat. Where to now? The woman in the suit asked. I need to check on a friend, I said. He's in a fridge at a cafe called the Velvet Drip. He's probably very cold. She nodded and spoke into her radio. Reroute to the north end. Priority 1. As we docked, I saw the crowds. People were standing in the streets, holding their phones, reading the leaks. There was no rioting. There was just a strange, heavy silence, the sound of a city finally breathing after being choked for a century. I walked into the cafe. The police tape was already up, but the officers stepped aside when they saw the woman in the suit. I ran to the back. Marcus was sitting on the floor, wrapped in a thermal blanket, sipping a cup of the cheap coffee he always complained about. He looked up, his eyes widening behind his cracked glasses. Lena, he croaked. You're late for your shift. I laughed, a sound that felt like it was breaking a decade of tension in my chest. I sat down on the floor next to him and took a sip of his coffee. It was terrible. It was bitter and burnt. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. I'm quitting, Marcus, I said. I figured, he replied, looking at the news on his phone. I don't think you're going to have time for latte art anymore. I looked at the charred teddy bear sitting on the counter. I wasn't sure what the future held. I didn't know if the people who wanted to meet me were friends or just a different kind of predator. But as I watched the sun pour through the front window of the Velvet Drip, I knew one thing for certain. No one was ever going to tell me to clear my booth again. The Velvet Drip was no longer a cafe. It was a monument to a life I had outgrown. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the lighthouse. The city was still reeling from the data dump, a slow-motion collapse of every pillar that had held the underworld together. I stood behind the counter, but I wasn't wearing an apron. I wore a tailored black coat that felt like armor. Marcus was there too, back on his feet and obsessively polishing the espresso machine as if the friction could erase the memory of the fridge. You don't have to be here, Lena, Marcus said, his voice soft. The people outside, they're waiting for a statement. Not a latte. I have one more order to fulfill, I replied, my eyes on the front door. The bell chimed. It wasn't a crowd. It was a single man, the commissioner of police. A man whose name had appeared on page 42 of the ledger. He looked smaller without his podium and his press team. He walked to the corner booth, the one where Moretti had sat, and slid into the seat. I didn't wait for him to speak. I walked over, carrying a single white ceramic cup. I set it down in front of him. 3 sugars, I said. And the exit is exactly where it was last time. The commissioner looked at the cup, his hands trembling. You think you've won? You've turned the city into a graveyard of reputations. There's no one left to lead. That's the point, I said, leaning over the table, my shadow falling across his face. The leadership was the rot. Now the ground is clear. If you want to stay in this booth, you'll pay the price. And the price today is a signed confession regarding the North End fire. I slid a single sheet of paper across the marble. This was the final piece of my father's legacy, the names of the men who had actually lit the match. The commissioner looked at the paper, then at the camera lens I had hidden in the menu stand on the table. He knew he was being watched by the very public he had lied to for years. He picked up my pen and signed. As he walked out, defeated and broken, I turned to the window. The black SUVs were gone. In their place were people, ordinary people, walking into the cafe to see the woman who had dared to argue with a kingpin. I picked up the charred teddy bear from the counter, the hard drive that had changed everything. I didn't need it anymore. The truth was out, and the little spark had finally become the fire. I walked to the back, handed Marcus the keys to the shop, and stepped out into the morning air. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a boss. For the first time in 24 years, I was just Lena. And the city was finally quiet. If you believe that the girl who fought for a 3-sugar coffee ended up saving the soul of the city, hit the like button so this story finds the ones who are still waiting for their turn to speak.